December in Petrolina always brought the blazing sun and vibrant colors, casting a warm glow over the town. The Moda family was preparing for one of the most significant milestones of their lives, the graduation ceremony of their eldest daughter, Isabella. Sandro and Lucia, proud parents of 3 children, were beaming with pride. Isabella had completed her education at a prestigious Catholic school with top honors, setting the stage for a promising future. That evening, their home was abuzz with the excitement of friends and relatives. All gathered to celebrate Isabella's achievement. Beatrice, the youngest of the Moda children, matched her sister's energy and joy. The 7-year-old, with her curly dark hair and sparkling smile, was the heart and soul of the family. She had a natural ability to draw attention and spread happiness wherever she went. Tonight, her pride for her older sister was palpable, and she was fully immersed in the festive atmosphere, her excitement evident in every movement. As the Moda family entered the festively decorated school hall, Beatrice clung to her mother's hand, chattering eagerly about how she wanted to dance and indulge in as many pastries as possible. Her childlike wonder was infectious, and despite their busyness, Sandro and Lucia couldn't help but smile at their daughter's exuberance. The evening she seemed to be unfolding perfectly. The hall, adorned with sparkling garlands and colorful balloons, was alive with animated conversations, laughter, and the cheerful strains of music. Lucia and Sandro took in the photographs displayed on the walls, proudly recounting Isabella's accomplishments to friends and family, while Beatrice delighted in the carefree joy of childhood. She twirled around the adults, showcasing her new dress, chosen especially for this special occasion, and basked in the attention it brought her. After some time, Beatrice asked for permission to get a drink of water. Lucia, noticing the drinking fountain near the gym doors, gave her a nod. Beatrice, full of enthusiasm, let go of her mother's hand and dashed toward the fountain, waving to her sister and father as she went. "Just don't take too long, dear," Lucia called out, but Beatrice was already lost in the crowd, her excitement palpable. Minutes ticked by, and Sandro's growing concern became evident. He glanced over at Lucia, who was now nervously scanning the hall. "She's probably just stopped to chat with someone," Sandro suggested, trying to sound reassuring, though his worry was clear. As the minutes turned into what felt like hours, the Moda family's initial anxiety gave way to mounting fear. Sandro went to check the fountain but found it empty. Lucia started asking guests if they had seen Beatrice, but no one had any information. The atmosphere in the hall began to shift from festive to tense. What started as a quiet concern among the Moda family quickly expanded as teachers, parents, and staff joined the search. The school's security team began a thorough search of the premises, closing off exits to ensure no one left while the search for the missing girl continued. Sandro and Lucia, their hearts racing, frantically searched every corner of the school. Little did they know, their lives were about to change forever. Hidden around a corner, in a dark and neglected gymnasium, stood a locker that had been unused for many years. This locker, overlooked and forgotten, would soon become the grim focal point of their worst fears. As the search intensified and hope dwindled, the discovery of Beatrice in that locker would bring with it not only the devastating reality of her disappearance but also a profound sorrow that would haunt the Moda family forever. Sandro Moda stood by the drinking fountain, looking around with a growing sense of anxiety. The place where his daughter should have been just a moment ago was empty. The fountain gurgled softly, a reminder of how easily she could have returned and continued the fun. But Beatrice was nowhere to be seen. "Beatrice," he called out, looking around. His voice had not yet reached panic, only a mild concern that could easily vanish when the little figure of the girl came into view. But time passed, and Beatrice did not appear. Lucia, sensing something was wrong, approached Sandro. "Where is she?" she asked anxiously, peering over her husband's shoulder. Sandro shook his head. "She should have come back," he replied, already realizing that their daughter wasn't just delayed. His heart ached, but he tried to hide it from Lucia. They quickly checked nearby corridors, peeking into classrooms and restrooms. In every room they looked into, there was emptiness, cold and oppressive. Lucia began to call out their daughter louder, her voice growing more strained. Panic began to slowly creep into their hearts. "Beatrice, Beatrice." Lucia no longer hid her fear, her cries echoed through the empty hallways. After several long minutes, when they returned to the hall, their eyes were filled with obvious worry. Sandro, trying to maintain his composure, approached one of the security guards. "Have you seen my daughter?" he asked, describing Beatrice's appearance and that she was wearing a white dress with a blue sash. The guard, seeing the father's distress, immediately got to work. He contacted his colleagues over the radio, and within minutes the whole school was on alert. Teachers, security guards, and parents began combing every corner of the building, from classrooms to maintenance areas. Isabella, Beatrice's older sister, upon learning what was happening, joined the search. She couldn't believe that her younger sister, with whom she had shared so much joy and fun, could disappear in one of the safest places, school. With friends, she searched every nook and cranny where Beatrice might be hiding. But she was nowhere to be found. Time seemed to stretch slowly, like through thick honey, each moment filled with fear and uncertainty. Lucia and Sandro felt helpless. Every place they hoped to find their daughter only brought more despair. At some point, one of the teachers approached them, his face pale and hands trembling. He whispered, "It seems I've found something. You need to come with me." Lucia clutched Sandro's hand, her legs barely holding her up. They followed the teacher to an old, long-abandoned gym that had not been entered in many years. As they approached the door, Lucia felt her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, it was dark, and the air was thick with the smell of dampness. The teacher pointed to an old locker in the corner. "There," he whispered. Sandro carefully approached the locker, his hands trembling. He paused for a moment, feeling a cold sweat on his back, and opened the door. Inside, among dusty boxes and broken sports equipment, lay a small body in a white dress with a blue sash. It was Beatrice. Her body bore multiple knife wounds, and her face was frozen in a look of terror. The world collapsed for Sandro and Lucia at that moment. They couldn't believe that their little girl, their joy and light, was lying here, deprived of life. Shock and pain pierced their hearts, making time stand still. The teacher who had brought them here stepped back, his face ashen. "We need to call the police," he whispered, already beginning to take out his phone, but his words were drowned out by Lucia's cries, tearing through the silence of the abandoned gym. Petrolina was a town where people knew each other by name, where news spread instantly, and where tragedies touched everyone. The morning of December 11, 2015, was no exception. The horrifying news of Beatrice Moda's death spread like wildfire. People could hardly believe what had happened. A little girl, a symbol of joy and innocence, was brutally murdered right within the walls of the school where she seemed to be completely safe. The Moda family, who had been at the peak of happiness just the day before, found themselves amid a terrifying nightmare. Lucia and Sandro were broken by grief. Their home, once filled with laughter and children's voices, was now shrouded in dead silence. Lucia could not tear her eyes away from a photo of Beatrice, who had recently been smiling brightly at the camera. She couldn't believe that this smile was gone forever. Sandro, usually strong and dependable, now looked like a shadow of his former self. He tried to be strong for his wife and children, but every thought of what had happened to his little girl felt like a knife cutting into his heart. He could not find peace, replaying over and over the moments when he searched the school, hoping that these terrifying scenes were just a nightmare from which he could wake up. Isabella, the older sister, felt a deep sense of guilt. She couldn't shake the thought that she should have been with Beatrice, that perhaps if she had paid more attention, this wouldn't have happened. She stayed in her room, silently shedding tears over photos of herself with Beatrice, captured in moments of joy that now seemed so distant. Relatives and friends gathered, unsure of how to support the Moda family. All words seemed empty and useless in the face of such a loss. Neighbors brought food and tried to help with daily chores. But no one could fill the void left by Beatrice's death. The school where the murder occurred was temporarily closed, and the police began their investigation. The principal and teachers were stunned, unable to believe that such a thing had happened on their watch. Guards and staff were subjected to thorough questioning. Everyone who had been at the graduation party was interviewed. But no one had answers to the main question: who could commit such a heinous crime and why? The media quickly picked up the story, and soon Petrolina found itself in the spotlight. Journalists blocked the Moda family's home, the school, and the police station, eager for any details. Rumors and theories began to circulate in the town, as everyone tried to understand what could have driven the killer to such a cruel act. But no one knew the real truth. Only the Moda family understood the depth of their grief, and no one could fathom how they would ever cope with the tragedy. Lucia and Sandro were paralyzed by pain, unable to think about the future, with each day steeped in hopelessness and loss. Beatrice's funeral was held a few days later, attended by all the residents of Petrolina. The coffin, adorned with white roses, symbolized the loss of innocence and purity embodied by the little girl. People wept, bowing their heads in respect and sorrow. Sandro, holding Lucia's hand, could barely stand, feeling his world crumble completely. Isabella stood silently nearby, her tears flowing uncontrollably. After the funeral, there was a sense of desolation. Lucia and Sandro returned to their empty home, which now felt alien to them. Everything around them reminded them of Beatrice, her toys, her room, her drawings on the refrigerator. Life in Petrolina continued, but for the Mota family, time seemed to have stopped. At the same time, the town lived in fear. If something like this could happen to Beatrice, who would be the next victim? Until the killer was found, no one felt safe. Parents anxiously sent their children to school, constantly looking over their shoulders, and police patrols doubled their presence on the streets. Petrolina would never be the same again. Immediately after Beatrice's body was discovered, the Petrolina police launched a large-scale investigation. That evening, the school was sealed off, and the crime scene was meticulously examined. The arriving investigators understood that they were facing a horrifying scene that shocked not only them but the entire town. They needed not only to find the killer but also to calm the panic that was beginning to spread among the residents. Leading the investigation was Inspector João Silva, an experienced detective with many years of service. He knew the case would be complex but was determined to find the culprit. Silva was known for his tirelessness and attention to detail. He immediately began questioning witnesses, starting with those who had been at the graduation party. Initially, all interrogations were conducted at the school. Teachers, staff, guards, parents, and even students were questioned, trying to uncover any detail that might shed light on Beatrice's disappearance and death. The guards claimed they hadn't noticed anyone suspicious that night. The school's entrances and exits were closely monitored, and no one left the premises without a check. However, despite their assurances, it became evident that someone had managed to bypass their security system. The teachers recalled seeing Beatrice at the drinking fountain. She was alone, but they didn't notice anything unusual. Some mentioned seeing her heading towards the gym, but no one paid much attention. The school had many guests, and a little girl among them didn't seem out of place. Isabella, Beatrice's older sister, was questioned with particular sensitivity. She was shaken and could barely speak, but the detectives tried to be as delicate as possible. Isabella said the last time she saw Beatrice was when she went to get a drink of water. At that moment, she was busy talking to friends and didn't notice when her younger sister left. Detectives quickly realized there was little evidence. There were no blood traces aside from those found on Beatrice's body and in the closet. The murder weapon was not found, complicating the investigation. It seemed that the perpetrator had carefully planned their actions and left nothing that could lead to their exposure. The first days of the investigation were particularly tense. The police tried to reconstruct the timeline of events, from the last sighting of Beatrice to the discovery of her body. Everyone who was at the school that evening was interviewed. Detectives looked for inconsistencies in testimonies, hoping to find a lead that would point to the culprit. Silva and his team knew that time was against them. The longer they couldn't find the killer, the greater the anxiety among the townspeople. Rumors and theories began to circulate in every neighborhood. Some claimed the killer was someone from the school staff. Others thought it could be a parent or even a random passerby who somehow entered the school. Inspector Silva decided to focus efforts on checking all possible suspects, especially those who had access to the school and could have remained unnoticed. The guards and maintenance staff were the first to be scrutinized. Each of them was thoroughly checked, their backgrounds, connections, and possible motives. No one was excluded from the list of suspects. However, all police efforts continued to lead to dead ends. People were questioned again and again, but no one could provide enough information for a breakthrough in the case. Every time the investigators thought they had a lead, it would falter, leaving them back at square one. At some point in the investigation, Silva began to suspect that the killer might be someone who knew the school and its grounds well, possibly even a staff member. This revelation prompted him to focus on those who had worked at the school for many years and knew every corner of it. One such person was a longtime security guard. His behavior didn't seem unusual, but some of his colleagues noted that he always kept to himself and was somewhat withdrawn. Silva decided to question him more thoroughly and verify his alibi. Meanwhile, the Moda household was in a state of complete desolation. Lucia and Sandro rarely left the house, remaining in deep shock. Isabella withdrew into herself, plagued by guilt and the unbearable pain of loss. Each new day brought new questions but no answers. The shadow of the killer loomed over the town, and no one knew when or how it would be revealed. Inspector Silva knew his team was under immense pressure, but he also understood that the truth had to be found, no matter how bitter it might be. Several weeks had passed since that terrible evening when Beatrice was found dead in the abandoned gymnasium. The investigation had stalled, and despite all the efforts of Inspector João Silva and his team, there was no real progress. The town had sunk into gloom, and fear continued to grow. The residents of Petrolina began to doubt whether the killer would ever be found, and the Moda family was on the brink of utter despair. However, in mid-December, when it seemed that all leads had long since gone cold, a breakthrough appeared that could change the course of the investigation. One morning, Inspector Silva received a phone call from one of his officers. The officer reported that surveillance cameras set up near the school had captured footage that could be crucial to the case. Silva immediately went to the police station, where the officer awaited him with the findings. The atmosphere in the surveillance room was tense. The monitor displayed a stretch of road near the school, where a car was recorded passing by the building on the night of the murder. The vehicle appeared unremarkable, but it was seen on the recordings multiple times within a short period, which drew the investigators' attention. This car passed by the school several times between 7:00 p.m. and 8:00 p.m., around the time Beatrice disappeared, the officer said, pointing to the screen. We checked other cameras in the area, and it didn't appear anywhere else, only near the school. Inspector Silva scrutinized the image. The car was dark, and the license plate was hard to distinguish in the footage. But this information was still valuable. It was the first real lead that could assist in the investigation. We need to find out who owns this car and who was driving it that night, Silva said firmly. He knew it could be a long process, but he now had renewed hope. Meanwhile, the investigative team continued to examine footage from other cameras, hoping to gather more information about the car's movements. They checked all nearby intersections and found that the car had left the school area a few minutes after it was seen on the previous recording. The investigators began working to identify the vehicle, sending queries to registration databases and interviewing residents in the area. They also started re-interviewing everyone who had been at the graduation party, asking if anyone had seen a suspicious car. At the same time, the police were contacted by a young woman named Camilla, who claimed she might have seen something important on the night of the murder. She wasn't sure if her information was useful and had hesitated for a long time before coming forward. Camilla described that on the night in question, as she was returning home from an evening walk, she noticed a dark car parked near the school. She observed that the driver stayed in the car for a long time and then, as if noticing her gaze, abruptly drove off. Camilla couldn't recall the make or license plate of the car, but her description of the driver matched what investigators had suspected: a middle-aged man with short dark hair and an unremarkable appearance. These two developments, the video footage and Camilla's testimony, gave Inspector Silva and his team a new impetus in the investigation. They understood that whoever was driving that car might have been involved in the crime or, at the very least, had witnessed something important. At the same time, information about the new lead leaked to the local media. Journalists, eager for sensational stories, began speculating about the suspect and his possible motives. Public attention to the case increased once again, and the pressure on the police intensified. Inspector Silva, however, remained focused. He understood that media hype could play both a positive and negative role in the investigation. It was important not to succumb to the pressure and to carefully verify all new evidence before concluding. Soon, the police received data about the car owner captured on the cameras. The vehicle was registered to a man named Marcos Alves, who lived near the school. That same day, Inspector Silva, along with a team of operatives, went to his home for questioning. When they arrived at the given address, Marcos Alves, a middle-aged man with a weary look, answered the door. He didn't appear frightened, but something was unsettling about his demeanor. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the car registered in your name," Silva said, showing his badge. Marcus, slightly tense, invited them inside. The questioning began in a neutral tone, but the tension in the air became increasingly palpable. Inspector Silva was determined to uncover what lay behind the calm exterior of this man and was prepared to ask questions that might lead them to the long-awaited truth. Marcus Alves, the man whose car had come under the investigators' scrutiny, sat across from Inspector João Silva in a cramped interrogation room. The air was thick with tension. Silva, an experienced detective, knew that every movement, glance, or word could give him a clue about whether he was dealing with an innocent witness or a cunning murderer. Marcus appeared calm, but his eyes betrayed an inner unease. He constantly fiddled with the edges of his shirt, and his voice trembled as he answered questions. Silva noted these details, watching his every gesture carefully. "Where were you on the evening of December 10th? Silva asked, leaning slightly forward to catch Marcus's reaction. Marcus paused as if recalling. "I was at home, watching TV. Yes, that's right, I was watching soccer. My city's team was playing. I think they even won. Can you confirm that? Was anyone with you?" Silva continued, keeping his gaze fixed on his interlocutor. Marcus shook his head. "No, I was alone. My wife was with her parents, and the kids were at camp. I often stay alone. It's not unusual." This response raised Silva's suspicions. Being alone on the night of the murder without an alibi seemed too suspicious. But the detective knew not to jump to conclusions. "We're interested in your car," Silva said, showing Marcus a photograph of the vehicle captured by the cameras. This car was seen near the school that night and appeared to pass by several times. "Can you explain why your car was in that area?" Marcus hesitated again. He was trying to come up with an answer that wouldn't incriminate him. "You know, I often drive around town. Maybe I was just cruising. Sometimes, to clear my head, I drive aimlessly, just to relax. I don't see anything strange about that." But Silva wasn't satisfied with this answer. He needed more. He knew that either Marcus was hiding something important or genuinely didn't realize how serious his situation was. "Marcus, understand that you are currently at the center of a murder investigation. Anything you say can have consequences. We can verify your statements. And if it turns out you're lying, it will only worsen your situation," Silva said sternly, hoping to force Marcus into revealing the truth. Marcus paled but continued to stand his ground. "I don't know what else to say. I didn't do anything. I was just driving, nothing more." Silva realized that Marcus was either a very good liar or truly innocent but hiding something. It might not be related to the murder, but something about his story didn't add up. After the interrogation, Silva left Marcus under surveillance and ordered a thorough check of his alibi. He also instructed operatives to review Marcus's phone calls from the night of the murder to determine who he had been in contact with. Gathering all possible information was crucial to ensuring Marcus was not involved in the heinous crime. Meanwhile, other suspects continued to be interrogated at the police station. Investigators examined any potential connections Marcus might have had with Petrolina residents and school staff, trying to find any clue that could shed light on his involvement in Beatrice's murder. A few days later, the results of the checks began to come in. Police discovered that on the night of the murder, Marcus had called the same number several times, which belonged to a woman named Ana Lopez. Her name was new to the investigators, and they decided to question her. Ana, who lived in a different part of town, immediately admitted that she had known Marcus for some time. She claimed their interaction was purely friendly, and on the night of the murder, they were just discussing everyday matters. She hadn't noticed anything suspicious and had never been to the school grounds. However, Marcus's attempt to hide his calls to Ana raised new questions for the investigators. When Silva re-interrogated Marcus, he directly questioned him about the calls to Ana Lopez. Marcus turned pale and, after some hesitation, admitted that he hadn't wanted to disclose his contact with Ana to avoid raising suspicions from his wife. But he continued to insist that their relationship was innocent and unrelated to the murder. Inspector Silva felt that the case was beginning to move forward, but he also knew there was still a long way to go before they could gather enough evidence to link Marcus or anyone else to the crime. There were more questions than answers, and the tension in the town continued to rise. Meanwhile, other investigators continued to explore alternative theories, interviewing new witnesses, and checking all possible leads. Time was against them, but Silva was determined to see the case through and find the killer hiding among the residents of Petrolina. While the police continued to verify Marcus Alves's alibi and his connection with Ana Lopez, the Beatrice case gradually accumulated new evidence. In Petrolina, rumors and speculations spread with incredible speed. Many residents were afraid to speak out, fearing that the killer could be someone from their circle, but some decided to come forward. The day after Marcus was re-interrogated, a middle-aged woman named Elena Costa came to the station. She appeared nervous but resolute. Elena claimed she had seen something on the night of the murder that had been troubling her. And despite her fear and doubts, she decided to share it with the police. "I saw that car you're talking about on TV," Elena began as soon as she sat down in the interrogation chair. Her voice trembled, and she kept glancing around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "It passed by my house. I was on the balcony smoking when I saw it slow down near the school. What bothered me was that there were two people in the car. The second one was sitting in the passenger seat." Inspector Silva immediately perked up. Until that moment, they had assumed there was only one person in the car, but if Elena was right, it could drastically change the case. Silva quickly started asking questions, trying to extract as much information as possible from the witness. "Are you sure you saw a second person? Can you describe him?" Silva asked, trying not to miss any details. Elena nodded, clearly nervous, but her words were confident. "I couldn't see his face clearly because it was dark and they were in the car. But it was a man. He seemed larger than the driver, maybe a few years older. They were in the car for about 5 minutes, then the driver said something to the other person, and they drove off towards the school." Silva paused, processing the information. This detail could mean that Marcus wasn't alone, and it opened new avenues for the investigation. If the second person indeed existed, he needed to be found as soon as possible. "Can you remember anything else? Perhaps something about their behavior that caught your attention?" Silva continued. Elena thought for a moment, recalling. "I remember that one of them, I think it was the driver, looked tense as if he was waiting for something. Also, they didn't turn on the lights in the car, as if they didn't want to be seen." These details might have seemed minor, but to Silva, they were like precious gems that could lead to solving the mystery. He thanked Elena for her testimony and ordered the investigative team to immediately search for the possible second suspect. Meanwhile, the investigators continued to check Marcus's alibi and explore all possible connections he might have had with others. They began re-interviewing people who were in the school area that night, hoping someone might have seen two men in the car or heard something related. However, an unexpected encounter occurred a few days later when Inspector Silva and his team went to the area where Marcus lived for additional investigation. They were about to question neighbors and check footage from nearby security cameras. As Silva and his partner, Officer Ricardo, approached Marcus's house, they saw an unfamiliar man exiting the building. He didn't belong to that residence, and upon seeing the police, he quickly turned to the side, trying to leave unnoticed. However, his behavior aroused suspicion, and Silva decided to stop him for questioning. "Excuse me, could you stop for a moment?" Silva called out, approaching the man. The man tensed up immediately but stopped and turned to face Silva. His expression was wary, and his hands were slightly trembling. Officer Ricardo quickly moved to stand beside Silva, ready for any situation. "What are you doing at this house? Are you waiting for someone?" Silva asked calmly. The man hesitated, as if searching for the right answer, then stammered, "I came to visit a friend. But it seems he's not home." Silva watched him closely, sensing that this person was hiding something important. "What's your friend's name, and are you sure he's not home?" Marcus. I just came to see how he's doing, but it looks like he's not here," the man replied, avoiding direct eye contact. This answer convinced Silva that the man was not just a casual acquaintance. He might be the second person from the car Elena described. "All right, but before you go, we need to ask you a few questions," Silva said, signaling Ricardo to detain the man. The man tried to leave, but the officers quickly restrained him. During the search, they found a phone with several unsent messages addressed to Marcus. The messages contained strange but alarming phrases: "Don't panic and we need to meet to discuss everything." This could only mean one thing: the man knew something or was directly involved in Beatrice's murder. Inspector Silva felt they were finally getting closer to unraveling the mystery. They took the man to the station for interrogation, where they planned to uncover the truth about his connections to Marcus and his role in that fateful night. The interrogation of the man, now the main suspect, was expected to shed light on what happened the night Beatrice was killed. Inspector João Silva and his team stood on the brink of a crucial breakthrough. After detaining the suspicious man who had tried to avoid talking to the police at Marcus's house, it became evident that they were finally closing in on the truth. The suspect, named Antonio Gomes, was brought to the station. He was behaving quietly and tensely, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. Inspector Silva immediately noticed that Antonio was trying to remain calm, but his hands were nervously rubbing together, and his eyes couldn't settle on any one spot. Before starting the interrogation, Silva gathered his team to discuss their strategy. They had reason to believe that Antonio was the second person in the car seen near the school on the night of the murder. However, they needed more information to prove this. "We need to be careful not to spook him," Silva said. "He's already scared, and if we push too hard, he might shut down or even ask for a lawyer. We need to find out what he knows and how he's connected to Marcus." Officer Ricardo nodded and suggested a gentle approach, starting with neutral questions to make Antonio feel comfortable and encourage him to talk. After a brief discussion, the team agreed with this plan, and Silva took on the task of leading the interrogation. Antonio sat at the table in the interrogation room when Silva entered. The inspector held a folder with case materials that he hoped would help uncover the truth. Silva sat down across from Antonio and, trying to speak as calmly and friendly as possible, began. "Antonio, I understand you might be feeling uncomfortable right now, but I want to assure you that we are here to sort out the situation. We need to understand how you were involved in this case and what you can tell us about the events that occurred on the night of December 10th. Antonio swallowed nervously but responded, "I already told your officers that I just came to visit a friend. Nothing more." Silva nodded, indicating that he understood his position, but did not rush into more pointed questions. "Do you know that your messages to Marcus were found on your phone? They seem quite important. Perhaps you could explain their content?" Antonio hesitated slightly but then said, "They were personal matters. I didn't want my wife to know I was in contact with Marcus. We've been friends for a long time, but recently our relationship became strained." Silva sensed that Antonio was beginning to open up. This might be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. "Why did your relationship become strained? Is it related to something that happened recently?" Antonio sighed and, after a pause, answered, "Marcus started getting involved in some activities I didn't want to know about. He was always a bit strange, but recently he became even more secretive. He said he had found a way to make quick money, but I felt it was something illegal." This response intrigued Silva. "And what was this method? Did he ask you for help?" Antonio shook his head. "No, he didn't ask for help. But one time, when we were in the car, he mentioned needing support with something. He didn't go into details. But I felt it was something very dangerous." Silva listened carefully, realizing that Antonio might be a key witness, even if he wasn't directly involved in the crime. Perhaps Marcus had tried to involve him in his plans, but Antonio had refused. "Were you with him in the car on the night Beatrice was murdered?" Silva asked, trying to be as straightforward as possible. Antonio paled but still answered, "Yes, I was. But I didn't know what he was planning. He just asked me to drop him off at the school. I didn't know what would happen that night." Antonio's words made Silva alert. He understood that he was dealing with someone who could be an unwitting participant or a witness who feared revealing everything due to fear of Marcus. "What happened after you arrived at the school?" Silva asked, now pressing for details. Antonio took a deep breath. "He got out of the car and told me to wait. He was inside for quite a while. When he came back, he looked scared and nervous. We drove back, and he told me not to tell anyone that we were there." These words were a significant breakthrough in the investigation. Antonio confirmed that Marcus was at the crime scene on the night of the murder, and this could be the missing link the investigation needed. Now, knowing they had a witness who could testify against Marcus, Silva understood that the next step was to convince Antonio to cooperate with the police and provide more detailed information. It wouldn't be easy, but Silva was prepared to do whatever it took to protect Antonio and his family if he agreed to help. Gathering his thoughts, Silva said, "Antonio, I know you're scared right now, but you can help us stop the person who did this. If you agree to cooperate, we'll provide you with protection. We won't let Marcus or anyone else harm you." Antonio, though trembling, nodded in agreement. He knew he had no other choice. Marcus might have been his friend, but now he had become his enemy. And the truth needed to come out, no matter how daunting the path to it might be. After questioning Antonio Gomes, Inspector Silva and his team felt they had found the key to the case. Now they needed to gather more evidence to definitively link Marcus Alves to the crime. Silva knew that the next crucial step would be conducting a comprehensive investigation and coordinating with other departments. First and foremost, Silva ordered a thorough review of all data related to Marcus and Antonio. The primary task was to determine how Marcus could have orchestrated his criminal activity and what his true intentions were. Investigators discovered that Marcus frequently communicated with certain individuals through anonymous online accounts. These connections suggested possible involvement with criminal organizations. The police began investigating these contacts, hoping to find specific links to Beatrice's murder. As the investigation continued, new evidence emerged. At an internet cafe on the outskirts of town, where a suspicious message had previously been found, investigators located surveillance footage. The footage showed a person very similar to Marcus spending a lot of time at a computer, browsing and sending messages. This discovery confirmed that Marcus was actively using anonymous channels for communication. Meanwhile, in Petrolina, a public campaign supported by the Mota family began. News and social media spread information that the police were close to solving the case, attracting the attention of many residents. People began sharing their observations and memories related to Beatrice's murder. One such account came from a local security guard who reported seeing several suspicious vehicles stopping near the school on the night of the murder. The guard described the cars and even mentioned that one was black and the other was silver. This testimony matched Antonio's statements and added a new dimension to the investigation. Investigators began analyzing surveillance footage from cameras around the school to identify the license plates of the suspicious vehicles. They also started checking all registered vehicles that matched the descriptions. At the same time, Silva arranged a meeting with Antonio Gomes to discuss his continued cooperation. Despite his anxiety, Antonio was willing to help the police by providing information about what he had seen and heard from Marcus. He also agreed to help identify other possible vehicles and people who might have been involved. Soon, thanks to Antonio's efforts and the data obtained from the surveillance cameras, investigators were able to form a clearer picture of the events. They found footage showing a black car, similar to the one described by the guard, approaching the rear entrance of the school. This footage could serve as evidence that someone was indeed lurking near the school that night. Silva carefully reviewed all the collected evidence and concluded that they had sufficient grounds to conduct searches at the homes linked to the suspects. This could be a decisive moment in the case. Based on all the collected material, the police organized a series of searches. One of these was targeted at Marcus Alves's home, where they looked for any additional evidence that could confirm his involvement in the crime. Another search involved agents checking locations associated with possible accomplices of Marcus. The searches of Marcus's and his potential associates' homes yielded significant results. In one of the houses, a series of records and documents were found, confirming that Marcus had indeed been in contact with criminal organizations. Furthermore, among the items discovered were personal belongings of Beatrice, indicating her connection to the crime. These findings marked a breakthrough. Now investigators had enough evidence to file charges and prepare for trial. Inspector Silva felt they were on the right path to solving the case. But until the court reached a final decision, they had to continue working to ensure the truth came to light and that the guilty parties received the justice they deserved. The Petrolina police were on edge. The breakthrough in Beatrice Mota's case was so significant that it attracted not only local attention but also national news coverage. Now that investigators had concrete evidence, they began focusing on the final revelation of the truth. The evidence collected from the searches reinforced their suspicions regarding Marcus Alves and his possible accomplices. However, to solidify the case, it was essential to scrutinize every detail and ensure that nothing was overlooked. Silva and his team started analyzing the recently discovered items and documents. Special attention was given to Beatrice's personal belongings found in one of the suspects' homes. Among them were school supplies, personal notes, and a small locket that she always wore. This locket became one of the most poignant elements of the case, as it not only testified to the connection with the victim but also served as the last physical reminder of her life. Silva decided to conduct a new interview with Antonio Gomes to ensure he fully understood the importance of his role in solving the crime. He wanted to obtain all possible details that could shed light on how and why Marcus and his associates committed the crime. "Antonio, we need to know everything you remember about what happened the night of the murder," Silva said, sitting across from Antonio in the interrogation room. Every detail could be important. Antonio nodded and began recounting his memories. Marcus was always reserved, but that night he seemed particularly agitated. He didn't want to say where he was going and was very nervous. "He just told me to wait for him at the school. When he came back, his face was pale, and he was very distressed. What exactly did he say or do when he returned?" Silva continued. "He didn't say anything," Antonio replied. "He just said everything was fine and asked me not to tell anyone that I saw him." Inspector Silva made notes and decided to check locations that might be related to Marcus's criminal activities. There was a possibility that he had hidden places or storage areas for stolen items and other information. One such location turned out to be a small warehouse in Petrolina's industrial zone. Registered under a fictitious name, Silva and his team went there, expecting it could be another crucial moment in the investigation. When they arrived, the warehouse door was slightly ajar, and inside, there was noticeable clutter, boxes, old equipment, and disorganized documents. The operatives began searching and soon discovered a box with documents and photographs that seemed unrelated to the case. However, amidst the chaos, Silva found several notes with names and addresses connected to a criminal organization that Marcus might have been involved with. One of the records was a map marking specific locations, possibly hideouts or important sites for the organization's activities. These findings were a significant step toward uncovering the remaining mysteries. Silva ordered a detailed analysis of the map and documents to determine where other potential evidence might be located or where the criminals might have planned their actions. Meanwhile, local news began discussing Beatrice's case again. With new evidence and confirmation of Marcus's connection to criminal organizations, public interest surged. Silva and his team knew they had a tremendous responsibility and needed to act quickly to prevent the suspects from evading justice. As a result, investigators began interviewing everyone who could be linked to the criminal organization using the information found in the documents. This included conducting interrogations, verifying alibis, and searching for other possible accomplices. One such accomplice was Miguel Rosa, who, according to the documents, was connected to Marcus's activities. Miguel was known as an intermediary in criminal transactions and could be a link between the organization and Marcus. His interrogation became the next step in the investigation. When Miguel arrived at the station, he was frightened. His behavior, like that of other suspects, alarmed the investigators. He began to explain that Marcus had been under pressure due to his actions and that Beatrice's murder was part of a complex scheme involving money and threats. Miguel confessed that Marcus acted under the pressure of a criminal organization demanding dangerous tasks from him. According to Miguel, the group wanted to use blackmail to force Marcus to meet their demands. However, the situation was complicated, and eventually, everything spiraled out of control. These confessions opened new horizons for the investigation and allowed investigators to start piecing together the puzzle. With Miguel's help, they could understand that Beatrice's murder was only one part of a more complex plan, and now they needed to determine how exactly Marcus and his associates were connected to the crime. Silva was confident that they were on the right track. The only remaining task was to gather all the final evidence to bring the case to a close and ensure justice for Beatrice and her family. In the coming days, the investigators planned to finalize their investigation, hoping that all the collected evidence and testimonies would lead to the final exposure of the criminals and the restoration of justice. The long-awaited moment had arrived. After months of intense investigation and hard work, Beatrice Moda's case was ready to enter its final stage. The court proceedings for her murder had begun, and the entire country was focused on the trial. The courtroom was packed. The Moda family, including Sandro and Lucia, sat on the benches, filled with anticipation and anxiety. Also present were representatives of the press, residents, and, of course, the prosecution and defense attorneys. Inspector João Silva and his team, including Antonio Gomes and other key witnesses, were prepared to present evidence and testimony. The first step in court was the presentation of the prosecution's case. The prosecutor detailed the facts of the case, emphasizing that Marcus Alves and his associates had committed Beatrice Moda's murder. The prosecutor painted a picture based on the evidence found during the searches, testimonies, and confessions collected throughout the investigation. Marcus, sitting in the courtroom, looked tense and dejected. His lawyers attempted to present him in a better light, claiming that he was forced to act under the pressure of a criminal organization and that his actions were not premeditated. However, the facts presented by the prosecutor appeared irrefutable. Inspector Silva took the witness stand and began his testimony. He recounted the course of the investigation, including key moments such as interrogations, searches, and discovered evidence. Silva described in detail how they concluded Marcus's involvement and his connections to the criminal organization. Then it was Antonio Gomez's turn. His testimony was particularly crucial, as he was a witness to what happened the night of the murder. Antonio spoke about his observations and interactions with Marcus, describing how he appeared tense and anxious that night. His testimony helped illustrate that Marcus was directly involved in the crime and tried to conceal his actions. The defense attorneys attempted to challenge Antonio's testimony, arguing that he was under pressure himself and might have been mistaken in his recollections. But Silva and the prosecutor convincingly demonstrated that all the testimony and evidence were consistent and confirmed the defendant's guilt. The next step in the trial was the testimony of experts. The forensic pathologist provided a report on the cause of Beatrice's death and confirmed that her injuries matched the description of the charges. A forensic specialist also confirmed that the evidence linked Marcus to the crime. The court proceedings continued in a tense atmosphere. Both sides presented their arguments, and the judge closely monitored the entire process. The wait for the verdict was a heavy trial for the Mota family. But they held on with the hope that justice would be served. Finally, the moment of the verdict arrived. The judge came out of the deliberation room and announced the sentence. Marcus Alves was found guilty of Beatrice Mota's murder. He received the maximum possible penalty for the case. The Mota family, though deeply mourning the loss of their daughter, felt some relief knowing that justice had been served. The verdict was an important step towards closing this tragic chapter of their lives. Inspector Silva and his team received recognition for their work. They could finally leave the case with a sense of accomplishment. But they knew that Beatrice Mota would forever live in the memory of her family and the community, and their work was not in vain. On that day, Petrolina realized that while justice can be difficult, it is achievable. The story of Beatrice Mota, despite its tragic end, served as a reminder of the importance of striving for truth and justice, even when the paths to them are fraught with obstacles.